Welcome to Beyond the Lens, where history comes alive, and every documentary takes you deeper than ever before. History isn't just written in books. It's carved into ancient ruins, hidden beneath the oceans. For breathtaking this is a journey beyond the lens.
Grim, urgent tone. August 24th, 1814. The American army is broken. British veterans are advancing through the streets, and Washington is burning. Barely 30 years after securing its independence, the United States was standing on the edge of total collapse. To understand how that happened, we have to look back at how the country tried to survive in its earliest days. As a young, neutral nation, the U.S. relied heavily on global trade, sending merchant ships to European ports. But Britain and France were locked in the Napoleonic Wars. Both empires blockaded each other's economies, and America was trapped, its trade routes quickly intercepted. The British Royal Navy had a massive fleet to maintain, and finding enough sailors was nearly impossible. So they instituted a policy called impressment. British warships would routinely stop American merchant vessels, search the crews, and violently kidnap sailors to force them into British service. In June 1807, this practice turned deadly. The British warship HMS Leopard fired upon the American frigate USS Chesapeake. Several Americans were killed, and 4 sailors were dragged away in chains. To the American public, these seizures were a direct assault on national sovereignty. Every sailor taken in chains was a reminder that their hard-won independence remained under threat. While tensions escalated at sea, American settlers pushing west into the untamed frontier met fierce resistance from Native American tribes. When Americans discovered that British officials in Canada were supplying weapons to Chief Tecumseh's Native American Confederacy, public paranoia and anger surged. Back in Congress, a passionate new generation of politicians, known as the Warhawks, seized on this anger. They demanded immediate military action to defend the nation's honor. These politicians operated on a massive assumption. They believed that taking British Canada would be effortless, and that Canadian citizens would eagerly welcome American troops as liberators. Fueled by this outrage and supreme overconfidence, President James Madison officially signed a declaration of war against Great Britain on June 18, 1812. The signing of this declaration committed the United States to a full-scale conflict, despite the fact that the nation's professional military was dwarfed by the power of the British Empire. The reality on the ground was immediate and harsh. The U.S. Army consisted of only a few thousand men led by inexperienced officers. Their attempts to invade Canada resulted in disastrous, muddy failures. A handful of surprising naval victories temporarily distracted the public. When British cannonballs harmlessly bounced off the thick wooden hull of the USS Constitution, the ship earned the nickname Old Ironsides and gave Americans a false sense of security. But in 1814, the geopolitical landscape flipped. This map illustrates the collapse of Napoleon's French Empire. With Napoleon defeated, British forces were left uncontested. Britain no longer needed to split its attention. Its battle-hardened military machine could now focus entirely on the United States. Thousands of veteran troops boarded ships and sailed straight for the American East Coast. America's window for a quick, easy war had officially closed. Their initial hubris had invited the world's greatest superpower directly to their shores. Looking at this layout of Washington City in 1814, we see a vulnerable, isolated settlement. Fewer than 10,000 residents lived here, navigating a landscape of muddy roads and incomplete government buildings. Despite receiving reports of British forces landing nearby, American officials made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the British would attack a larger, wealthier port city like Baltimore, rather than the muddy capital. By ignoring the threat, they left the symbolic heart of the young nation almost completely undefended. General Robert Ross saw the opening. He led nearly 4,500 disciplined, battle-tested British veterans through the Maryland woods, marching straight toward Washington. On August 24, American forces finally tried to make a stand at the Battle of Bladensburg. The American militias actually outnumbered the British, but they lacked serious training. Faced with disciplined British fire, panic swept through the American lines, and the soldiers broke rank. The retreat was so chaotic and humiliating that people mockingly called it the Bladensburg Races. The collapse was total, forcing President Madison to flee for his life. The consequences of American overconfidence had arrived. The defensive lines were shattered. The road to the capital was completely open. Unopposed, British veterans marched into Washington to exact their revenge. In August 1814, the United States was a fragile experiment. It possessed a small military, a depleted treasury, and was now facing the full attention of the world's most powerful empire. A British armada had arrived on the coast, carrying thousands of veteran troops fresh from the Napoleonic Wars. On August 24th, these forces marched into Washington, D.C., encountering almost no resistance. The capital was empty. The president, his cabinet, and the majority of the residents had already fled. An eerie silence hung over the abandoned seats of power as the British columns reached the heart of the city. This engraving illustrates the occupation. General Robert Ross ordered troops to focus on government property, retaliating for the American burning of York, present-day Toronto. In the background, the results are clear. The Executive Mansion, Capitol Building, and Library of Congress burn, creating massive smoke columns. The psychological impact was immediate. The physical infrastructure of the federal government had been reduced to blackened shells. To the Americans watching their capital burn, it was a moment of total vulnerability, a realization that their young republic could be physically erased. The destruction of Washington stripped the country of its physical center. With the buildings gone and the government in hiding, the survival of the Union no longer rested on wood and stone. It now depended on whether the public could find something else to rally around, a shared idea that was more durable than the architecture the British had destroyed. That effort began with the actions of First Lady Dolley Madison. In the final hours before the British arrived at the White House, she refused to leave until she had secured the most important records of the young nation's history, prioritizing the past over her own safety. The most significant artifact she saved was this, the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. Because the frame was bolted to the wall, workers had to break it apart and roll the canvas to fit it into her escape carriage. By rescuing the physical likeness of the country's first president, Madison ensured that the primary symbol of the founding generation remained intact, even as the Executive Mansion burned. It was the first piece of a new national memory, pulled directly from the flames. Then, less than 24 hours after the fires began, a freak weather event struck the city. A violent thunderstorm and a reported tornado tore through Washington, drenching the flames and scattering British troops with lethal winds and debris. The storm did more than just put out the fires. It forced the British to abandon the city prematurely. Several soldiers were killed by falling debris, and the damage to British equipment was significant enough to stall their immediate momentum. To many Americans, the timing was too precise to be mere meteorology. They interpreted the storm as a sign of divine protection. This narrative provided the first spark of renewed confidence, the belief that while the buildings were vulnerable, the Republic itself was being shielded by a higher power. The conflict then moved to Baltimore, a city far better prepared for an assault. For 25 hours, British warships launched a continuous bombardment of rockets and mortar shells at Fort McHenry, the gateway to the harbor. At dawn, the bombardment ceased. Francis Scott Key, watching from a British ship, saw this weathered fabric still flying above the fort. The massive 15-star flag had survived 1,000 projectiles, signaling that the defenses had held. Key immediately captured the moment in a poem. His words transformed the flag from a military signal into a permanent cultural symbol of endurance. It gave Americans a visual anchor for their survival, a banner that remained standing when the capital had fallen. While these battles raged, diplomats in Europe were already signing a peace treaty. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war as a stalemate. But because news traveled slowly across the Atlantic, the armies in America remained in the field. This delay led to the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. General Andrew Jackson led a diverse force of soldiers, sailors, and volunteers to a lopsided victory, inflicting over 2,000 British casualties while losing fewer than 100 men. The victory arrived on the East Coast at the exact same time as the news of the peace treaty. The country linked the two events together. Jackson's success allowed Americans to view the end of the war not as a diplomatic draw, but as a definitive military triumph. The geopolitical reality was much simpler. The War of 1812 ended with no change in territory. The borders remained exactly where they had been before the first shot was fired. However, the strategic landscape shifted. Britain recognized the United States could not be easily reconquered, and the death of Tecumseh permanently weakened Native American resistance in the Northwest, clearing the way for American westward expansion. This view of the modern White House is the result of a deliberate choice. After the fire, the government chose to rebuild on the same fire-scarred foundation, transforming the ruins of 1814 into a permanent statement of national continuity. The Capitol building, seen here today, followed a similar path. Its reconstruction was framed as proof that the American democratic system could survive an attempt at total destruction and emerge intact. The burning of Washington exposed the physical fragility of a young nation, but from those ashes, a shared identity was built. The rescued portrait, the indestructible flag, and the story of Jackson's victory provided the Republic with its first enduring set of national symbols, assets that proved far more durable than the architecture the British had destroyed.